So I'm from Sxweyxwiyam. Sxweyxwiyam means where the river levels and widens. I'm originally from Boston Bar. So I actually carry two names, and I just got in trouble from a good friend of mine a couple of days ago about not talking about my Mchalsie name, because two very important elders to me had given me the name Mchalsie, and it's actually Interior Salish and the Kafmik name. And the name yémiya I just got last October from my Stalo family. So when I was introducing myself around here as yémiya, saying that I would only use Mchalsie when I'm in the interior, and I got in trouble for that. So I have to mention now that I carry two names. Yémiya is a Stalo name, and Mchalsie is actually an Interior Salish name. In fact, my last name, Mchalsie, is actually from my grandfather. My grandfather, as a young boy, was known as Bakupsh, and as he got older, he was known as Mchalsie, which means sacred strength inside. Then as he got older, he's known as Meshk, which means like a storyteller or a preacher. When he was baptized, he's given the name Antoine, and then when the Indian agent came to register him on the band list, he didn't have a surname, he just had the name Antoine. And so the Indian agent asked him what he wanted for surname, so he said he wanted his two adult names, Meshk and Mchalsie. So he wrote Mchalsie. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about reconciling Stalo place names. So I operate also what is called Bad Rock Tours. With Bad Rock Tours, if you want information, you can go www.stalotourism, and I'm doing one of the tours this afternoon as well. But I find taking people out on the land and sharing place names is the best way to learn about Stalo culture and history. And so I do 10 different tours between Yale and Surrey, including the tour that we're doing this afternoon, and the Chilliwack tour, Surrey tour, tours at both residential schools, St. Mary's and Coquilitza, Harrison Lake, Harrison River, and a tour at an old village site upriver of Yale. So all the tours, of course, are all about place names. So I've done a lot of work on place names, and so that's why I chose the talk this morning about reconciling Stalo place names. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the place names that are out there, and especially some of the early geographers tried to acknowledge our place names, but in the end, they made some mistakes, and so things kind of got moved around. And this is a good example here, is right on the page there. So we have on here, you can see you guys can look at that one. I'll look at this one. So you can see on the left side there is Sxweyxwiyam, or if you look on the map, it says Mount Cheam. Okay, and then you look on the right side, on the map it says Lady Peak, but actually it's Squamay, it's the dog. And so Dave Sheppy and I were talking one time, and he has a theory, and I think it's kind of correct. It's almost like the geographers were looking at the names, and they just accidentally slid it over. Okay, because Lady Peak, which is the dog, on the right side is actually, the lady is actually the one on the left. Cheam is actually the name of the village site called Cheam, which means always wild strawberries, and it's actually off of the picture to the left. So between this mountain and the Agassiz Bridge, that's where the village of Cheam is. So it almost looks like they took the two names and just slid them over. Okay, so the village of Cheam became that mountain, and then the lady was the dog. So it seems like that's the mistake that was made there. But just to let you know what the story is about, so Sxweyxwiyam then, the one on the left, this is a story shared by late Mrs. Amy Cooper from Fraser Valley. She's originally from up in Sxweyxwiyam, my community. She said a long time ago there was a woman who lived in this area. She got married and moved down south, and she married a man down there. She had 6 children, 3 sons, 3 daughters. She decided to come back home, and she left her husband down there. He was transformed into Mount Baker. She left her 3 sons down there, Mount Shasta, Mount Sxweyxwiyam, Mount Hood, I think. It all depends on which elder tells the story. There's a number of mountains that they use. Those are the 3 I'm most familiar with. And then she took her 3 daughters and her dog with her, and she went back home. And when she got back home up there, that's when she was transformed into that mountain and given the responsibility to watch over the river, watch over the salmon, and watch over the people. And that's why she's often referred to as the Mother Mountain. And of course, she took her dog with her. And her dog was transformed into the mountain behind her, so that's the mountain on the right, and that's why you can see the head there. You can see the nose on the left side, the bridge of the nose, eyebrow, forehead, 2 little ears, and then the back of the neck. And that's Sxweyxwiyam. She also took her 3 daughters with her, and her 3 daughters are transformed into little peaks. So you look on the left side, on the left peak, on the left side you see a very prominent pointed peak. That is Sxweyxwiyam, that's her oldest daughter. Then right behind her is the kind of rounded peak, that's Iowa, that's the second daughter. Then the youngest daughter, Mchalsie, you can't see her in the photograph here, and you actually have to go to the site. It's actually Anderson Creek, where Anderson Creek comes off there, right next to the Popcom overpass, and you'll see the little hill there, and that's actually the youngest daughter, Mchalsie. Her name comes from the crying, she's the crying one, because in our language the word for crying is cham, so that's the beginning of her name, Mchalsie, the crying one. The reason she's crying is because she wanted to be up high with her 2 older sisters, because her 2 older sisters are way up high and they have a good vantage point, but she's transformed into a lower mountain. So reconciling place names, I think that would be something to consider. Actually, given Mount Chiam the proper name of Sxweyxwiyam, which actually means rehydrating something, and it also part of the name has something to do with the glacier that's in behind the area there. And then, of course, the Sxweyxwiyam would be the name for the dog. Okay, so that's one example there. We'll move on here. Oh, so and then the other thing to consider too is the language. So we have 3 different dialects. So you'll notice right across the middle there, sxwéxwiyam. It's a very kind of flat English way of pronouncing it, and that's what the linguists use to describe all 3 dialects. So there's 3 main dialects. So you look on the right side, we have what is called sxwéxwiyam. In the middle, there's what's called hunkmeenum, and then on the left side is called hulkmeenum. So you'll notice the left side is on east coast of Vancouver Island, Duncan and Nanaimo, Couch, and those 3 main groups. And then the language starts just on the other side of Yale, 10 kilometers north of Yale. And so when you look at those main dialects, upriver has the L, and it's articulated a little bit more, so that's why we would say sxwéxwiyam. Downriver, the L becomes an N, and they speak a little bit faster, and so sxwéxwiyam becomes hunkmeenum. And then on the island, they use both L's and N's, and we think because there are relatives over there, and they accessed resources both in the downriver part of the river and the upriver part, and I think that's why they use both the L's and N's. So over there, they say hunkmeenum. Okay, so all the place names are in these this group in the atlas. When I was because I was working with upriver elders, whenever I was working on a downriver name that had an N on it, they'd make me change the N to an L. Otherwise, it's confusing. They didn't know what it was about. So I was using a flip chart, so I'd have to rewrite it without the N and make the N an L, and then they go, okay, now we understand that. Otherwise, if they saw the N, it was like confusing to them. Okay, and then a good example of that transition is Sxweyxwiyam. And again, the Sxweyxwiyam, actually, they took their proper name back. The Indian agent, I think he had a downriver or an island interpreter, because they actually named that place Lakahaman. And then they went back to the original name, which is Sxweyxwiyam. But the thing is, so remember now, the L downriver becomes an N. And if any of you are familiar with that area over there, you probably heard of Nikaman Slough, Nikaman Mountain, Nikaman Island. Well, where does that word Nikaman comes from? Well, it's actually the downriver pronunciation of the name Sxweyxwiyam. So Sxweyxwiyam would become Nekaman. So that's where Nikaman comes from. Okay, but the proper name is Sxweyxwiyam. So they just recently, about last decade or so, went back to the original name. So when you're entering their territory, you see a big sign in proper sxwéxwiyam entering Sxweyxwiyam territory. Another example showing that shift of the language is up in Yale. There's an elk that was transformed into stone called Kayits. And downriver, because they speak a little bit faster, they knock one of the sounds off. So Kayits becomes Kayits. Okay? So that's the language. So we try to make sure that we use the language and not try to shift it. And then this here is the stories of, or the travels of Mchalsie. So Mchalsie, and so a lot of the place names have to do with Mchalsie. So two words, or one word that has 2 meanings. Sxweyxwiyam. So Sxweyxwiyam is the word for, and these are the only 2 meanings for that word. So Sxweyxwiyam has to do with the time period where the elders say when the world was mixed up, when animals and people could talk to each other, animals and people could transformed from one another. There are a lot of bad Indian doctors, a lot of bad warriors, a lot of resources that we couldn't use today, a lot of resources that were in unusable forms, and they say even our genitals were in the wrong place as well. So the second meaning for sxwéxwiyam is stories from that time period about Mchalsie. Mchalsie is the transformers, according to George Chehalis, who first shared that in the late 1890s. He says that Mchalsie was the 4 children of red-headed woodpecker and black bear. So red-headed woodpecker had 2 wives. One was black bear, one was grizzly bear. He had 4 children with black bear and none with grizzly bear. And the story gets kind of violent. I can't change the story. And a lot of there's violence in lots of our stories. But anyways, grizzly bear got into a quarrel with the red-headed woodpecker. She killed her husband. She herself was killed in the fight, left black bear as a widow, left the 4 children as orphans. Those 4 children were given special powers and given the responsibility to travel through the land to make the world right. So they started at the head of Harrison Lake, made their way down to the Fraser River, or what we call Stalo, up to the sunrise. Once they reached the sunrise, they traveled through the sky to the sunset, came back upriver again, and disappeared into the sunrise. And all through their travels, they're doing all these different transformations, transforming ancestors into resources, transforming bad people into stone, or transforming Sxweyxwiyam, like it was transformed into the mountain. And so there's all kinds of different stories that have to do with that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the places. So I don't want to put my glasses on, I can't read this. Okay, so let's look at some of these examples here. So hope, our name for hope is actually Tzakals, and Tzakals does not mean hope. And hope actually supposed to have 3 meanings or 3 stories as to why it's called hope. But our name Tzakals means bare or bald, and if you're familiar with the area, you'll notice it's where the river runs north to south and gets to Hope and it starts running west. And you also notice when you're down here how far apart the mountains are. You get up towards Hope, the mountains kind of close in. Creates a funnel effect, and the wind that's always blowing that way. It's a steady breeze that always blows into Hope. And that steady breeze doesn't allow the branches to grow on top of the trees there. So next time you're in Hope, you look at the evergreen trees, you'll see on the west side, on top of the trees is bare or bald, and that's where the name Tzakals comes from. Yémiya Lake, that's another name that was, so sometimes there's an interest in our names, and rather than paying respect to making sure that they got the exact location, they would take that name and use it in other places. So this name is actually further upriver and across the river from where it's listed on the map here. So Yémiya Lake comes from the word Chalitch. Chalitch, according to Rosaline George, means where there's only basic foods, no foods that grow to spice up your meal. And it also means where the frost heaves the ground. And so that's actually the name of a reserve that belongs to my community of Sxwéxwiyam. So it's between Ruby Creek and Seabird Island. And if any of you are familiar with the Yémiya Safety Rest Area, or what used to be the Johnson Slough Rest Area, just to the east of that, that's the name Chalitch. Then the CPR, they actually seem to make quite a few mistakes, because they're the first thing that went through in 1882, right? So they're the ones that were trying to incorporate names, and then they're the ones that ended up messing up with the names. And so this is one of them. So they took that name Chalitch from the original location and moved it to Seabird. And so when you go to Seabird, you'll see Chalitch Road. You won't see Chalitch Station anymore, because they actually had a station there that was called Chalitch Station. And so because Chalitch Station was there, they had the road that went to Chalitch Station was called Chalitch Road. So everybody in Seabird think that that's the name of that place is Chalitch. So a lot of people call that part of the reserve Chalitch, but it isn't. The original Chalitch is further upriver off the reserve, actually past the bluff. So that's one of the mistakes that they made. And then, of course, Chalitch was, again, whatever geographer did it, applied it to that lake where it's shown on here. And also there's a channel downriver of Jones Hill, upriver of Popcom, where Hurling Island is. There's a channel there, and that channel is also called Chalitch. So this was a popular name. I guess they liked it, so they moved it and had it all these different locations. But the original location is, as I said, is Indian Reserve number 3, just downriver of Ruby Creek. So not on here is another one that CPR messed up on is the Cat's Landing. So about 10 kilometers west of Hope on the north side of the river. There's a place there called Chilliwack. Chilliwack has to do with the gravel bar at the mouth. It's very similar to the name Tawasin, which is actually Chawathan, which means gravel. So upriver, it's gravel bar sticking out into the river. Chawathan is a piece of land sticking out into the sea. And of course, it's a downriver, so that's why they have an N at the end. Upriver has the L at the end. But Cat's Landing, according to my uncle, South Almathuk, Grand Chief Peter Dennis Peters, was when steamboats were running. They stopped there to get wood. A lot of the First Nations people up and down the valley used to provide wood to the steamboats. And they stopped there, and a pregnant cat that was on board the boat and got off. And then they left the pregnant cat there. They went up to Yale, picked up their cargo, came back, stopped there for more wood, and the pregnant cat came aboard on the gangplank with her kittens. So that's why they called it Cat's Landing. So if you ever look at the old references to it, it's CATS, Cat's Landing. But 1882, CPR took that and switched it over to KATZ, right? So sounds like it's a German name with that sound, but. And so now you see a big sign there that says Cat's Landing. Well, they took the landing off it now. Now they just call it Cats, right? So again, they messed up with the name there. Another one that they messed up on is Hatsuck. And so if you look at the name, and I don't think it's on this. Oh, it is, Hatsuck Lake. So you see how it's written there, Hatzic. When you pronounce that, you're forced to say Hatsuck, which is in Halkmale means measuring the genitals or measuring the penis, which has nothing to do with the place. So how I found that out was the anthropologist that used to work with us, he was the one that made a mistake, and he named the rock down there Hatzic Rock without consulting the elders, because when I went to meet with the elders about this name, and of course I had it spelt in the proper Halkmale, and three ladies and the late Roy Point. And when I asked them, I used to write it on a flip chart, and they said, what does this name mean? And I always used Brent Galloway's work as a background to provide me with information, and I'm always looking for more information. And so all Brent Galloway was told was that it was had to do with a plant that grew in abundance in that area. And so I asked them, I said, what does this name mean? And they said, then right away, the lady Amelia Douglas, still alive, and she was actually there in the 70s when they told Brent Galloway that it had to do with the plant that grew in abundance. And so right away she piped up, oh, it's got to do with the plant that grows in abundance. I said, well, I'm trying to find out a little bit more information. That's not very much information about the place, so is there anything more you can tell me, like what is the plant or anything else you could tell me about the place? And they all kind of shrugged their shoulders and acted like they didn't know anything more about it. And then I was going to move to the next place name. I figured, well, I guess that's all the information I'm going to get about that place. And then the late Roy Point, that's Stephen Point's dad, he chimed in and he goes, oh, doesn't the first part of that name mean to measure? So when you write it in proper Halkmale, it's XATH, hats. And I looked at the ladies and they all kind of nodded their heads. I said, yeah. So, oh, right. So I wrote on my flip chart to measure. And I said, what about EQ? What does that mean? And they all kind of shrugged their shoulders and are looking at each other and looking at me. And they said they didn't know what it meant. And even Roy said he didn't know what it meant. And so I left from there. And then later on, Keith got a hold of Wayne Suttle's report from Catesy. So Wayne Suttles is an anthropologist, did place names on the Pitt River. And he also looked upriver and looked at other names that had to do with, that looked like they're indigenous. And he asked about it, and I can't remember which one it was. He said, but it was either measuring the penis or measuring the genitals. And then Brian Tom, an anthropologist who was working for us at the time, I think he's down at University of Victoria now, but he found David Rosin's report on place names for the Cowichan. And in there, again, either measuring the genitals or measuring the penis. So I went back to the elders, told them the new information that I found out. They all started laughing, and they said, yeah, that's what it means. But the thing is, Tilly piped in, and she said, yeah, but that's not the proper pronunciation. She said, when you read it the way it's written, Hatzic, you're saying measuring the genitals. But the original name is Hatsuck, and she said Johnny Leon from Chehalis was the one that told her. And so I actually looked into, what's his name, George Gibbs, Bounty Survey, He actually did a map of the lake, and he wrote on there H-A-A-T-S-U-K. So he had it very close. So again, I realized that it wasn't him, because he had it pretty close. So instead of the X sound, which is the like hats, right? He put an H, and he put a double A to kind of give length to the A sound, so hat suck. And so I think he had it more closer to the proper pronunciation. But I think it was CPR again in 1882. Wow, that time just flies. 1882, CPR wrote H-A-T-Z-I-C, and that's, so when you say that, you're saying measuring the genitals. So I approached the anthropologist, asked him if he met with the elders, asked him for his tape recording when he met with the elders, didn't have one. Asked him if he had notes from his meeting with the elders, he didn't have any. I said, you did meet with the elders? And he said, no. So he named it on his own. And so the elders said, we got to change the name of the site. So that's why the name of the site was changed to Chetam. And Chetam actually means zapped. And when Mchalsie was traveling through the land, doing all the different transformations, he would point at things, and that's how he zapped them. So he extended his finger out like that. And that's why you'll notice we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to point at people. We're not allowed to. At our longhouse gatherings, you'll notice everyone points like this. No one ever extends their finger out like that. All right, so let me see if there's anything else on here. Chehalis is actually Elis, and it means the beating heart. So everybody says Chehalis, but it's properly pronounced Elis. Coquitlam is Quequitlam. Cultus, two stories. And Keith was the one that found the reference to cultus. It's actually a Chinook word, and it means worthless. And I can't remember who the name of the explorer was, or Hudson Bay Company employee traveling across there, and the water was rough, and swore at the lake and just went, cultus, which means worthless, and that's where it got its name. It's a Chinook word. But our name for it actually is Sxweyxwiyam. Sxweyxwiyam means water coming in. Okay, and there's other places that I know. There's a place up in Hope that we call Kamkama, and it's got to do with the breast of a mountain goat, and this Quamthelis, the ridge below it's got the shoulders of a mountain goat, but the name is actually Ogilvy, and that's one of the problems is, then there's actually a Facebook thing, one of my fellow students from school, and were talking about it, and somebody made a point about how a lot of our names of mountains in this area are named after people who have never even been here. And I don't think Ogilvy was ever around here. But anyways, my fellow student made this big, long argument and talked really highly of Ogilvy. I can't remember what Ogilvy was or who he was, but talked really highly of it. So, I mean, when you read that and read this, the work that this guy did, it's kind of important work. But still, if he wasn't even around here, why do we have a mountain named after him? And I think we should actually go to Kamkama or use the name. And I know the BC Geographical Placenames, which is an arm of the provincial government. I know they have a policy in place of if people start using a name, they'll change it, right? And then so that's one of the I'm hoping that will happen with my tours, because one of the things I realized, a friend of mine pointed out about 4 years ago, she said, I'm only learning to sxwéxwiyám names because I don't talk about the English names on my tours. So if you ever come on my tour and you don't know the English names of those mountains, you're only going to learn the sxwéxwiyám name. So you might start using that name, and then so eventually I'm hoping that those names will get changed back to the proper sxwéxwiyám name. All right, Keith. Exit, stage left.
Thank you so much, Sonny. I'm going to be kind of picking up on some of the themes that Sonny was talking about and trying to bring those into a dialogue with some of the discussions and debates and conflicts that are happening right now within settler society as people struggle to try to, how do we decolonize the landscape? How do we indigenize the landscape? And how do we do that in a respectful and way that works for people? I want to start with these two quotes from Matilda Tilly-Gutierrez. She's one of the elders that Sonny had started with. These are special places. If we don't look after them, our people will continue to get harmed. That's something Tilly said in a conversation with Sonny and I. And then on another occasion, she said, to not use our family fishing sites is a sin. And she was teaching Sonny and I the Halkomelem names for a couple of the fishing sites in the canyon. And then she added that if you're not using it, it's a sin. And, I think of the way Sonny does the tours that you're going to be going on this afternoon, teaching people the names and the history with it. And sometimes you'll hear settlers, maybe well-intentioned settlers, saying, well, we've put those names on there because that reflects our history. We have to, that's a way to teach our history. And yet, when's the last time you remember anybody driving by saying, and Ogilvy, remember Ogilvy is that's such and such? Nobody does that, right? And I think, as Sonny says, it's because, Ogilvy might have been a great man, but he was somewhere else doing something else, and it was part of a process of renaming the landscape. Right? This is a famous painting by John Gatt. It's from 1872. It's referred to as, often referred to as Manifest Destiny. It's America's future. And it depicts sort of the idea that Western society is just marching forward with technology, light, Christendom, agriculture, and indigenous people and wildlife are just receding into the darkness as the West moves forward. That's settler colonialism. It's settler colonialism in Canada and the United States. It's regarded as the normative thing. I know that's changing, but for a lot of us, if you're my generation or older, you grew up just thinking that was natural, that was normal, that's what was supposed to happen. And it's a system that displaces indigenous people in order to replace them on the landscape. So settler colonists with the mentality of settler colonialism come into, they want land and resources. That's what they want. They don't necessarily want indigenous labor the way the British did, say, in India or other places like that. In settler colonialism, you want to displace indigenous people who are blocking your access to the land, displace them onto reserves, so you can replace them on the land and control that land and resources. Therefore, it's important to think of it as a structure. It's a structure, not an event. It's not like you can say, or an episode. It started here and it ended here. It's ongoing. And even if there's government changes in Canada, there's no end to settler colonialism. It's baked into the system of governance and economics in our country. And so it requires structural change if we want to change it. It's enabled by that idea of whiteness that you'll hear people talking about. A lot of sociologists have brought this concept forward, which is really important. The idea that by being white, by seeing the world through a lens of whiteness that in the past has ascribed certain characteristics to people of different color or with different facial characteristics, you can then understand and control those situations. And so I'm not going to get into all of that, but this is all part and parcel of how settler colonialism unfolds. And it's designed to be invisible to all of us who benefit from it. For Sxweyxwiyam, settlers like myself. Sxweyxwiyam is the Halkomelem word, downriver, I guess it's Sxweyxwiyam, I guess? Yeah. Sxweyxwiyam is the Halkomelem word that means insatiably hungry people. Hungry to the point of starving people. Because we just consume, right? And that is what a settler colonist is. That's exactly what that term translates as. So it's the Stalo figured it out really quick. In the 19th century, I think settler colonialism, it rationalized colonialism on the assumption that indigenous people were a vanishing race. This was a very common assumption in the 19th century. In the 1860s, there was a study that was done by an early anthropologist who said, by about 1920, all the Aboriginal people in North America will be gone. They will have disappeared because of smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, measles, all diseases that came from Asia, Europe, and Africa, right? The old world where they had domesticated animals that were seeing viruses jump the species barrier. That didn't happen here in North America. And so this becomes a very self-serving myth that settlers have about indigenous people, to the point where here in British Columbia, where under British common law there should have been treaties negotiated and signed on the mainland, that people like Joseph Trutch, Birch, Moody, and others said, well, we just wait a while. If we just wait a while, that expensive cost will kind of disappear and take care of itself. They'll either die from diseases or be assimilated. So Place naming is part of that process. Place naming is it's integral component to the colonial process of taking over. Indigenous people ascribe names that guided them while traveling. Sonny mentioned a place where the river widens, a place, right, all these kind of things. They reflected their knowledge sites that were bountiful with food resources. An abundant plant grew here. It turns out it's a sacred plant that's used to make the small little walls that are within the longhouse and used in ceremonial purposes, the fluff from I think of the Helcamel word now. What's bulrushes? Thank you. Couldn't think of the English word for a second. His work is working. And then we also see the commemoration of historical events and occurrences, right, happening in places like this is where Chetam, where this happened, this man was transformed into an elk or a deer, right? And they document stories of origin and stories of transformation. They're the stories that made the world what it is. If Sonny had more time, and I encourage you to invite him back on another occasion or to take one of his different tours, he also talks about how this is an ongoing process. So there are Stalo people who use English place names, but they're English place names that Stalo people have given to a place like Bottle Cap Beach, is it? Beer Bottle Cap Beach at one place, and others, like a whole bunch of others that are, because it's a living culture, and maybe some of the kids aren't speaking Helcamalan, but they have a name for it that isn't part of the documented official settler government name for it. Now, settler place naming on the other side, or renaming, right, which is what it is, it contributes to that settler colonial process of erasure, displacement, and replacement on the land. To rename something is to exert a form of control over something, right? We do this, if you're scared when you're feeling sick and you go see a doctor and the doctor says, oh, you've got such and such. It's that naming process that enables you to have, you might be frightening if it's a bad diagnosis, but it gives you a sense of comfort because once you name it, you can begin to control it. What are the treatments I need to do? What should I do? I change my lifestyle in what way? When things aren't named, they scare people. If you ever have a chance, a wonderful short story that I really encourage everybody to read who's a settler is by Mark Twain. It's The Diary of Adam and Eve. It's absolutely hilarious, and it's Mark Twain's sort of slightly cynical spin on how Adam and Eve went around and needed to name things, and how Eve was really in charge of that process. So it was an interesting, but it's about controlling. You assert some kind of control. And it ascribes meaning into those places. That's what that does. We ascribe a meaning once we name it. And once we ascribe that, we have a sense of knowing it. Right? So once it's an unknown, settlers come here from afar, they don't know this place, they haven't taken the time and energy to engage with Indigenous people to learn this place. And so then we begin to rename and then ascribe meaning into those new names. This transforms the unknown into the known so it can be understood, it can be regulated, it can be controlled. That's what this is doing through mapping processes and others. And settler colonialism, as I mentioned earlier, quoting here Patrick Wolfe, it destroys to replace, right? The idea is that we create a place, we call it British Columbia, Vancouver, Chilliwack, and in the process we are displacing and erasing and destroying something else to create that in all kinds of ways. So that renaming is a means by which settlers, they eclipse not only Indigenous place names, but they eliminate the intangible oral evidence of an Indigenous presence, so as to replace it with a written, mapped, surveyed settler colonial permanence on the landscape. Settler colonialism, or settler communication, is biased. Now, there's a wonderful classic works by the historian Harold Innis, Communication Theorist. If you haven't looked at that and you've got time on your hands, you're retired, I really encourage you to read it. He has this wonderful theorization about time and space and different communication mediums and how some are reflected in Indigenous communities, some are very much a reflection of Western society, and he talks about other societies around the world. So what we have is Indigenous settler colonial bias is around geographical distance, right? So think of the example, Simon Fraser comes down the Fraser River. He leaves all of his supplies up behind Hell's Gate. But one thing he takes with him is his portable desk and his pen and his papers, right? He brings that with us, right? You've written about this. And so what happens with that paper gets transported over huge geographies back to Eastern Canada, back to Britain, and then through that written piece of paper over vast geographical space, colonial powers can assert control by claiming we know that space. This is no longer thought to be the Columbia River. We know this to be the Fraser River. We know what kind of plants and animals are in it because he discussed what its economic value is and worth. And so it becomes the process of claiming over large geographies, right? Traditionally, for Indigenous people, you needed to be present to listen to the oral traditions, the sharings of place names, and they connect you to a place deeply in time as opposed to broadly over geography. For example, the Stalo never used to have a word for Toronto. Why? Because Toronto's not here. It wasn't in their purview, right? So their stories are deep temporal stories that say this place ties us to this place. Western communication bias is over geography. Written and mapped settler place names provide broad geographical controlled forms of distant control. You don't need to be present to learn about them. You have an atlas, you have a history book. You learn about things from a distance through the written word, and now even more rapidly with the internet, right? And one consequence of the settler naming is, of course, the erasure of Indigenous sacredness on the landscape. Sonny was talking about sacred sites on the landscape. He just barely got to talk about them. He's got a full repertoire of stories, right? What spaces deserve special protection? If you're thinking about this in our society today, what does the provincial government or the federal government protect on the landscape? Because in Canada, until very, very recently, it was science, i.e. environmental protection, and economics, tourism potential or economic value of a place, that were the final authoritative determinants about whether a site would be protected or developed, open for development and exploitation as either urban or rural or commercial space, or protected from it, right? In Europe and Asia and Africa, where all settler Canadians come from, right? It's the economic and science are not the final arbitrators of determining whether a place or space should be protected, right? But they are two important factors, but they're not the final ones. So whereas Canadian settler colonists left behind our sacred places in other places, and we know that someone back there is taking care of them. So a lot of people in Canada still refer to the Holy Lands as somewhere far away that were holy to their ancestors and their traditions, as opposed to this being a holy land. That's the Holy Land. You don't have to worry if you're a Muslim that tomorrow someone might put a mega mall where Mecca is, because someone over there is taking care of it and protecting it, or Lourdes, or whatever that might be. Here in North America, settler colonists create the terra nullius. This is a blank slate that we can start to name and then control. Right? And that means that we can think of all of our place names really as memoryscapes. And they fall into two categories broadly. One is Indigenous and one is settler. And they don't have to be at odds with each other, but they largely have been because of the way things work in terms of control. So to name a space is to associate a memory and to assert a degree of control, as I said. And settlers have embedded mnemonic triggers throughout the landscape that speak of the triumph of the colonial process. And Mount Ogilvy in Hope is one of those colonial triumphs. Mount Garibaldi, for example, right? Mount Garibaldi was never here. It wasn't even an Italian who named Mount Garibaldi after Garibaldi, right? It was because some British people who were here at the time were impressed by Garibaldi's work at reunifying the Italian peninsula into a unified state, right? So they celebrated that here. There are many voices today that call for names of colonial figures to be erased so that Indigenous toponyms can be reapplied. We've heard Sonny talking about some of this today, right? And so people like Governor Seymour, Joseph Trutch, and others who we know did things that were harmful and often intentionally harmful, not just negligently harmful in the past to Indigenous people. And to engage in this, I think necessarily it's a process of Indigenous resurgence and the complementary process of colonial settler Indigenous reconciliation. But I suggest that we need to create a matrix that really weighs out how do we start to engage with these, because what we're seeing is a muscular settler backlash in some areas, and I don't think that's what we want to trigger, because then the fight is on. But that doesn't mean that we just absolve that and let it go either. So some criteria that I think are important to consider: is there a known Indigenous name, the way Sonny was talking about it? Is there a name for that mountain? Is there a name for that lake? That's the place to start. Is the site, the place, the feature one of high significance to Indigenous people? If it is, that should rise to the top of the kind of places that we want to rename. Is the process of renaming going to contribute to Indigenous resurgence? Is this in some way going to assist Indigenous people as they reassert some level of control over land, resources, territory, and themselves through self-governance? That's an important criteria. And is the process going to contribute to creating a more positive relationship between Indigenous people and settlers, ultimately? Those things should all be questions that we're asking as we move into this. And I think there are some additional criteria too. Those ones have been talked about a fair bit, but I think there's some others. Is the settler naming it's the settler name commemorating or celebrating someone or something that is explicitly associated with settler colonialism. The names Trutch, the name Dewdney, the name Birch, the name Vancouver, the name Victoria, Moody. And if so, then there's a double colonial erasure going on here, because not only has the place been named through a colonial process, but it's been named by someone who did things that were overtly colonial, that were perhaps improper even by the standards of the day, let alone the standards of today, of that day and of today. And is the settler name offensive? So, for example, both Canada and the United States government now have taken away the pejorative word for Indigenous women, the S word, from sites that are in federal parks and on federal lands in both countries, but not necessarily everywhere else. And there are a lot of other terms that are offensive as well. So I think in selecting locations for renaming, we want to be careful so that we don't contribute to the process of helping the structures of settler colonialism become even more invisible. This would defeat the part of the purpose, right? Because that's precisely what the strategy and logic of settler colonialism is. So, for example, a space that is populated with Indigenous place names could come to be seen as indigenized, despite the fact that there's little real movement towards the operationalization of Indigenous rights and title in those spaces. Another way to think about this might be to say, in our efforts to remove settler names and reapply Indigenous names, that we do that in a way that does not inadvertently create and contribute to muscular settler backlash or to the politics of colonial forgetting. And I think those are two real important issues that have been largely overlooked in the debates and the discussions that are taking place around renaming. And thereby, if we do either of those things, we're further strengthening those invisible structures of white privilege and settler colonialism. And there are two separate goals here, I think, and they're intertwined in this process. We want to decolonize a landscape, and we want to indigenize a landscape. Removing settler names and replacing them with Indigenous names accomplishes both of those things. It does both of those things. And so that, I think, it should be the number one kind of space that we go to, the objective that we're moving towards. But if that's compromised by settler colonial forgetting, then that can diminish something, right? So because settler colonialism is a structure, it's built into our government and economic systems, and not an event that can just be sort of turned off and ended one day, it will require structural reform to actually transcend it, right? Just naming it can just be an icing on the top of a cake that you really wouldn't want to eat, for example. Renaming an event with a legacy, it can also be co-opted by settlers and become something symbolic. So I think this means we want to ask ourselves some key questions. Are Chilliwack, Nanaimo, Sechelt, Squamish less colonial and more Indigenous places than Maple Ridge or Hope because they have those names? Right? I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for that, but I'm not certain that just having the name makes it a less colonized place. And a place like Maple Ridge or Hope, as Sonny mentioned, there's three speculations about how Hope got its name. All of them are just pure speculation. We just don't know, right? We just don't know. There's no record of why the Hudson Bay Company initially called it Hope. But to ask a different question, really, if it's an Indigenous site that is tied to an economic or political figure that has caused harm to Indigenous people. 2 minutes, good. So names like Vancouver, like that is an overtly colonial name. The guy sailed by. We've named a city after him because it claims this whole space. We don't want to forget that happened, because to forget it is colonial amnesia, right? But do we want to celebrate that? So these are names that can be used in both ways, right? They can be used as educational points, but they can also be renamed. So Powell River, there's a big debate in Powell River right now, my hometown, about whether that name should be removed because of Powell's role as the first superintendent of Indian Affairs. Birch Bay, named after Birch, who was the one who plotted with Trutch about the reduction and disavowance of all of the original reserves that were created along the Fraser Corridor in Thompson and Okanagan by James Douglas in cooperation with Indigenous people. So, are these places explicitly associated with colonial processes? I think they are, right? So as we move forward to renaming and indigenizing, what I'm doing is encouraging people to think in terms of bringing the power of orality and ritual back into that process. I think this is a way that we can do this, and we can be more sensitive, I think, and have a wider range of opportunities. How do we regularly reinforce the memory-making act of ascribing meaning back into a landscape? So if we're going to rename something, or if we choose not to rename something because people have decided it's just too important, then let's have educational processes and people in schools and curriculum that actually talk about that process. I'm one of these people with mixed, ambivalent feelings about the tearing down of a lot of the statues, because I think that gives a huge amount of satisfaction for the 20 minutes that we tear it down. But once it's gone, we've lost the mnemonic figure that we could then point to and say, this is a problem because this guy's being commemorated for all of these broad structures. I think, so I'm not opposed to tearing down statues. I think some statues need to be torn down, but I'm worried that the process of just tearing them down, when we don't replace that or bring that forward with something that is educational, can be dangerous. And I think some settler names, for example, could potentially be cleansed or cleaned. One of the things that Coast Salish people do is people carry names. Names, people don't, it's not my name, I'm carrying a name that's been given to me by my family. If I dishonor that name, the name will be stripped from me, but the name continues, but the name is then washed and cleansed in ceremony, in potlatch, right? And then can be used again, ongoing. So is it possible to cleanse some of the colonial names? Is that possible? I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying these are the kinds of questions that if we engage with Indigenous people in actual conversations that say, how does your culture deal with names and naming? And is there a way that we can do this together to think of names and spaces that might be helpful? Places that just are stones, mountains, lakes, let's rename them. No one lives on Mount Cheam is going to be upset that you changed the name of Mount Cheam. It's not affecting them, right? But I think that does come up when we talk about Vancouver, Victoria, Powell River, Port Moody. There's people who've invested meaning into that name, even if they don't know the story of the person whose name is behind it. And that means we can get people getting resistant, and we have to be, I'm not saying cater to white fragility and cater to white comfort, but I think that means that we don't want to, stir up the settler colonial anxieties and resentment that then lead to a muscular reassertion of those colonial impositions on society. And so I think there are new names that we, as Indigenous people and settlers, could potentially make together for places. In my hometown of Powell River, again, the regional district has gone from being the Powell River Regional District to the Cathet Regional District, which simply means working together. So the community, a white community, came up with, in consultation with Indigenous people, an Indigenous name for a space that hadn't been named before except as an extension of Powell Lake, Powell River, the colonial, original colonial towns. So I think that those are real possibilities. And also the language in the middle. Sonny mentioned Cultus Lake, Skookumchuck Narrows. There are places out there that refer to that time period when Indigenous people and settlers were still kind of sharing power on the landscape, and were still communicating to each other in ways that didn't privilege only one side of that conversation. And I think maybe bringing back some of those Chinook jargon names might be a really nice way to talk about the relationship that used to exist and the possibilities that slipped away. And then finally, are there ways to rename that distinguish something that is distinct and sometimes overlapping? So like, what are we trying to do with the name? Are we trying to celebrate? Are we trying to commemorate? Are we trying to memorialize? Is it something like Remembrance Day where we're never to forget? Those questions are really important, and they haven't been asked, they were not asked in the original process of the naming of British Columbia. And I'm going to stop there. These are just sort of repeating some of my high points. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today. And Sonny, thank you very much.
I'm Sonny. I have such a close affinity to Hatzic Rock, as you know. And I do recall Aggie Victor teaching us that waterway that comes out of the lake that makes a peculiar bend, which is still there today, the Hatzic Creek, is why it had the reference name that they giggled about. In a time when it was not shameful to be able to speak about body parts. So it was a colonial imposition to be embarrassed about penises. And everybody knew it in those early days, and it wasn't a big deal. And yeah, they did collect a lot of bulrushes there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's a Hatzic. The proper name Hatzic means sacred bulrushes. I didn't mention that earlier.
Yes?
For the past decade, I've been pulling together a list of, I know with the Francophone Historical Society, a list of probably now 300 place names in French that were from the fur trade period, right? So basically like 60 years worth, and then they were all replaced. So you're giving me not noticed, but I'm realizing now that I'm missing part of that text. I have to add now the First Nations original name. And my second point is, I think, and what I've heard from a lot of people, and it's not in reticence, it's a difficulty that they find, is that I'm excited when I see I cross a bridge and there's a stream and it's got the First Nations name. I can't read the name. And it comes down to, on that moment, the moment of learning a new name, if it's not, and it's difficult, it's signage, is that moment lost on people?
Well, I'll just say I know the Stalo for the upriver Fraser River region, they continue to use what's referred to as the sxwéxwiyam practical orthography, and that was developed with Stalo elders and linguists back in the late 60s, early 70s, so that every letter could be typed on a manual typewriter, and everybody could go home and learn it. So if you see the signs that the Stalo community put up, you can read them, right? But a lot of other communities are using international phonetics because that can be read by anybody who's familiar with that from anywhere in the world. So we need to, if we're going to be using international phonetics around BC, then we need to start teaching that in the schools so that people can properly pronounce those words. But the Stalo took a more middle ground kind of pathway.
And there's only a few difficult sounds that are in there, like the word X, or the letter X is pronounced ch. So you notice how I say Mchalsie, that's with an X, right? The name for the mother mountain is Sxweyxwiyam. But you notice that first sound, well, the two sounds in there, LH, that's you just put your tongue on top of your top teeth and blow air through the sides. And you'll hear the young children who are still learning how to speak making that sound. So if young children can make that sound, an adult should be able to make it, right? So Sxweyxwiyam is the mother mountain. And then then there's other rules too, like for instance, OY is always pronounced I. The letter O is always A unless it has a flat line on top. Letter I is always pronounced E. Yeah, so there's once you get into it, you can see it's fairly simple. Just looks kind of hard at the beginning.
Olympics 2010, Squamish did a lot of work in their territory. Which phonetic alphabet they use?
Squamish?
Yeah.
I think they have their own.
So that's on those green road signs that tell you it's in the Squamish language.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have road signs here too, from the Chilliwack Museum. Ron Denman did a project, so you can see these. I think it's about 7 or 8 signs that have the original sxwéxwiyam name. They're kind of small signs, but they're there. They're out there. Yeah.
You were talking about at the start of your introduction, or a talk, the 3 dialects.
Yep.
And I was kind of curious, is that because there wasn't a lot of integration between the 2 groups, like the reason why they were the languages developed so independently as opposed to being more similar than?
I think what linguists say is that the longer people have occupied a territory, the more complex their language becomes. And I know I always talk about London, England, because I know there the language that's spoken there is English. But I understand that you can visit different parts of London and there's different parts of the language. And I had a guy get up speaking to me. I can't remember what it was. There's some English dialect. And you can barely understand it, but it was English. You had to listen closely. And it was like, wow, he's speaking English, but the way he's saying it just sounds so different, right? So same here. So we have the 3 main dialects, but what I didn't get into is that all 3 main dialects are even more complex. We also have what the linguists refer to as microdialects. So sxwéxwiyam has Samath, which is another tribal division or microdialect. Sxweyxwiyam has Teet, Palal, Elis, Scowlitz, and Lakamo. Those are all microdialects or tribes of sxwéxwiyam. Then, of course, Hunkminam downriver is also broken up into tribal divisions, and same with Hulkminam on the island, well, mainly the 3 waterways, Duncan, Nanaimo, Cowichan. But the Teet, because more of our population lived in the upriver area, the Teet dialect in the past was actually broken up into 5 smaller dialects. You know, so it's more complex, and you have to look at the geography of the land as well, and that's why you start seeing how the like now everybody shops at Save-On or Safeway or whatever. But in the old days, when you look at the geography of the land, it provided different resources. like Yale is the only place that you can wind dry salmon. You can't wind dry salmon anywhere else, right? And then of course Musqueam is where you get the saltwater resources. Then in between those two places, there's all these other places where you obtain the Wapato, or else where you obtain or you salt the salmon, like the different fish that are salted versus the different fish that are dried. And so once you start understanding those places, then you can start seeing how people have their own little place where they live.
And were they close enough that they still could communicate?
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's still what is the winter dance that happens. And then also, even if you read in the Fort Langley Journal, 700 Cowichan canoes heading up in one day, heading up to get access to the wind-dried salmon up in Yale.
Two quick comments. So I just wanted to follow up on Maurice's question around how to make languages, how to help settler colonialists understand Indigenous language terms. So it'd be great if you could put QR codes on those signs, or I mean, and I appreciate the work that Indigenous people have done to help settler colonialists learn the language. I hear your point. There's some work for us to do in terms of being able to pronounce these place names. But I think places like the renaming of the Riverview lands, where that work came along, and you can go online, you can listen to it, you can hear Indigenous speakers saying that word in the language so that you can learn it. So it'd be great if they use technology, just a thought. And I just want to thank you so much, both of you, for the presentation. It's amazing. I work in local government, and I'm sure many of us here work in local government, or we're, members of communities, and we'd like to be allies in this work. And I was just wondering sort of what advice you would have for people who want to support the work that you've talked about today.
Well, something that's just coming out that I just helped work on is the district of Chilliwack is doing a short little film on all of the First Nations communities in and around the municipality of Chilliwack, and there's 9 of them. And so that video is coming out soon. And so, and they're about 30 seconds about talking about each village or each community, the name and the meaning, and a little bit of history about the place. So that's a good step.
At the Peace and Reconciliation Center here on campus, we've launched in partnership with the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center, the Stalo Tribal Council, the Stalo Nation, and the Grand Chiefs Council, an allyship building program. And so we're in our 2nd year now. It starts in January. It runs for a year. But there's capacity for 100 people to be in that class. And the location where the classes take place moves around the valley a little bit during the year, so it's not privileging any people in one community not having to travel as far as the others. So there's some opportunities like that too we're putting together.
I'm wondering about the process a little bit more. Queen Charlotte City has successfully, as a community, adopted a new name. Georgia Strait is now the Salish Sea. It seems like people are open to this, but what else could be done to move it further down the road and in a broader sense? I don't think there's been a lot of pushback on Salish Sea. It's been adopted and accepted.
Absolutely. And plus the Salish Sea is one of the examples where it has 2 names, because it still is the Gulf Strait of Georgia and the Salish Sea and the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Puget Sound, right? So some places have been renamed in a way where it's like, we'll keep both names. And that was that was a decision people made. Others are like, replace that name, right? And then sometimes it's replace it with an existing name, which I think is the easiest and most straightforward, especially for places where people that aren't new places. Like there was no Vancouver before. People in Vancouver will often say, I'm from the territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish people, right? And Sonny and I have talked about this. Well, where's your house? Because you're not in all 3 of those. The city of Vancouver has a border that cuts into all 3 of those territories, but your house, your school, your place of work is in one of those communities' territories, and you should get to know that as opposed to that gloss, which is really, again, privileging the European settler dimensions. But because there was no Vancouver, there isn't a name to replace Vancouver with. It's not like there's, the old Hunkaminam name for Vancouver. So you could either pick a spot that maybe represents something that was there, or a new Indigenous name for it, or maybe you just say, and I've heard elders in some of the communities where there's been Indigenous elders in some of the communities where a settler community has been asked to rename, some of the elders have come forward and said, we're not so much saying you can't give it a European, Western, British, English name. We just don't want the name of that guy who was really offensive to us and hurt our community. And so in some cases, they're passing it back and saying, go ahead and rename it if you want. Name it with us if you want. Just please get rid of that name that really is offensive to us.
Yeah, we had an opportunity back in 79 or 80. There's a creek that ran through Mchalsie Indian Reserve, and we went to the regional district, and they said that it doesn't have a name. And because we wondered what the name of the creek was, they said, well, you guys can name it. So we went back to the community to consult with the community to come up with a name. Then we went back to the regional district, and they said, oh, somebody already named it. So they're telling us we could name it, but then they went and named it anyway. So Freytag Creek, and where that name comes from, I have no idea, but that's the name of that creek.
Also in BC, there was a process a few years back, it's getting to be more than a few years now, where there used to be, 25 Ruby Creeks. And so the province went around saying, okay, we only really want one Ruby Creek. We only want one Westview. We only want, and so a whole bunch of places were named. But for those that didn't have settler residences on it, the government just came through and said, what do you guys locally call it? And do you have a second backup name for it? They didn't even ask at that time Indigenous people, but that process has happened, and the world didn't fall apart, right? So it only comes down to, it's if some, I think where the tension really gets tense is, like what I see in my hometown of Powell River. None of us knew who Powell was. No one ever came and said, today is Powell Day, we celebrate the things he did. None of us knew that, right? But people have now, my family who's been there, for several generations, have an affiliation for the name, right? They associate that name with their growing up in that space, not with Powell. Some of them are now trying to justify Powell, right? But that's what happens is people become attached to their memory of that space, but not necessarily the original colonial intention. And that's what's causing, in my view anyway, the tensions within the community. I don't think anybody's trying to defend Powell. Some people are very clearly and rightly saying Powell doesn't deserve to have a city named after him, especially since he never lived here, nothing like that, and he's associated with colonial power imposition. But others are saying, well, that's the town my mom was born in, that's the town I was born in, I don't want to change that name. That's where, and we haven't really worked out a way to navigate that yet.
Is your proposed criteria available online or someplace?
I can make it available fairly soon. I've just got a couple more people I want to talk to about it first. That's my hope, and I was hoping through the Peace and Reconciliation Center we have here to kind of make it available with some, additional text to kind of just give people, not saying this is anyway prescriptive, but here's some ways that you can approach this, and here's some things you might want to consider to kind of help guide people so that we can, as much as possible, avoid the people getting entrenched in one side or the other and not speaking to each other and making things worse.
Every tribe is different in terms of the place names and how they want to share that outside of their own community. And there's a few on Vancouver Island that are very protective of their place names, and they require permission from the tribes to use them. Can you talk a little bit about maybe why some tribes, as they're uncovering and going through the process of identifying place names that have existed for many years, what that perspective means for the colonial settlers?
I'm not familiar with it, but I know all our place names around here are open. We have no restrictions on place names. They're all open. We can openly talk about them because they're basically used as ways of navigating through our territory or finding out what sort of resources are out there, and so they're all open. We don't have any restrictions that say. We have a GIS program, has about 733 place names on it, and as far as I know, there's not a category that says hide this name. There might be uses that we hide, like for instance, places where winter dancers leave their sticks, those sort of things, and we mark those on a map as a place, a sacred place. And when people ask, well, why is it sacred? Well, we're governing that, we're taking care of that. You don't need to know why it's sacred, right? And so just stay away from it. Yeah.
I think some Indigenous communities rightly say, you'll use our name, but nothing changes, right? Right? Again, I asked that question, is Chilliwack a more Indigenous space because it's named Chilliwack than Abbotsford? Like, are the attitudes different? Do Stalo people get treated with more respect in either of those communities? So the name itself doesn't necessarily mean that you've decolonized or created a place of reconciliation. And often, even with the Indigenous names, we, as settlers, forget even that they are Indigenous names. I used to live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I was at the University of Saskatchewan. I went to a conference that was in Chicago, and it was a big conference, and a fellow walked up to me from the University of Chicago, looked at my place name, and he goes, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. He says, is that an Indian name? And I looked at him and said, Chicago. Like, yeah, and so is yours. But he had no idea. He says, "Oh, Chicago. Oh, right." So I can see why people might be a little upset. You're using our name, but you haven't made any changes in attitude.
I think it comes up with using an ancestral name or someone that's in our oral history that's important. I know it's the golf course in Maple Ridge that uses the name Squamish. And I know the Katzie people are trying to get them to stop using that name because it's a very important ancestor to them. But I think they lost the court case. I think the golf course still maintains it as Squamish.
Thank you very much.